In the autumn of 1863, within a western Missouri county that older maps still identified as Blackwater, 9 households disappeared over a single harvest season. Not 9 individuals, but 9 complete families, men, women, children, grandparents, hired laborers, and even the dogs that rested beneath the porches. By the time the first killing frost arrived in November, 9 farmsteads stood deserted, with half-eaten meals remaining on tables, cradles still swaying in the drafts, and Bibles left open to the pages being read when the event, whatever it was, occurred. The county clerk who initially compiled the list was himself deceased before Christmas, and the ledger he maintained was sealed in a locked cabinet within the Jefferson City State House for over 60 years, until a historian finally forced it open in the 1920s. Inside, he discovered a single sheet of paper attached to the cover's interior, written in a trembling hand, containing 4 words that have never received a satisfactory explanation. Before proceeding with the tale of Blackwater County, please take a moment to subscribe to this channel and share in the comments which state or city you are joining us from tonight. What you are about to hear represents the kind of history deliberately buried, and those who buried it were counting on everyone forgetting. The 4 words on that pinned sheet read, "They took them willing." To comprehend why a county clerk in western Missouri would pen those words in a quivering hand before consuming laudanum in a Sedalia boarding house, succumbing to what the coroner politely termed nervous exhaustion, one must understand what Blackwater County represented in the summer of 1863 and what it had already transformed into. By the time the final family vanished, one must recognize a specific form of American darkness that wears no uniform, rides beneath no flag, yet flourishes in the gaps between flags when the ordinary bonds between neighbors have been suspended by the larger cruelties of the world. In short, one must understand what civil war does to the land and its people when the armies remain distant, and the only soldiers encountered are those who knock at your door after midnight. Blackwater County sat along the lower stretches of the Blackwater River, a slow-moving brown waterway feeding into the Lamine and eventually the Missouri. The land was fertile, not the rich black bottom soil of the lower Mississippi, but rolling prairie interspersed with timber, limestone outcroppings, clear springs, and sufficient flat ground between the hills to cultivate hemp, tobacco, and winter wheat. Families had been establishing themselves there since the 1830s, most arriving from Kentucky and Tennessee via flatboat and wagon. Carrying the accents and stubborn Scotch, Irish pride of the Upper South. They brought their ballots and their feuds, their cornbread recipes and their whiskey formulas, their distrust of strangers and fierce loyalty to kin. They possessed a hardness forged through 3 generations of clearing timber and breaking sod, along with a softer quality lying just beneath. A tenderness that emerged at barn raisings, weddings, and burials. A softness that would eventually be exploited against them. By 1860, the census recorded slightly over 4,000 residents in the county, scattered across some 600 farms, with 2 small crossroads towns and a 3rd settlement near the river landing where steamboats had called before the war. The landing settlement, named Marlowe's Ferry after the man who first operated a flatboat across the river in 1834, featured grain warehouses, a blacksmith shop, a general store, and 3 saloons, conducting a brisk trade in pork, tobacco, hemp, and the rougher commerce that typically gathers around river ports. Upstream, at the junction of the Old State Road and the Military Road, stood the county seat, New Salisbury, with its red brick courthouse built in 1851, a stone jail, a bank, 2 churches, and a line of clapboard storefronts facing the square. Everyone in the county visited New Salisbury at least twice annually. Once to pay taxes, and once to attend the fall circuit court. And everyone knew everyone else by sight, if not by name. The families residing there were not wealthy. A handful held enslaved individuals, usually 1 or 2 house servants and a field hand or 2, but most were plain farmers working their own land with their own hands and sons. They attended church on Sundays at one of 4 small white frame meeting houses, buried their dead in family plots on the back 40, and trusted their neighbors because necessity demanded it. The nearest doctor was 11 miles away in fair weather and 3 days distant in poor conditions. If a child developed a fever at midnight, one did not wait for the county physician. Instead, one rode to the nearest farmhouse and knocked. The man who answered, regardless of his politics, his wariness, or any grudge between families, would take his coat from its peg and ride back through the darkness. That trust, that network of small loyalties between neighbors, was the first thing the war destroyed. Missouri in 1863 was not a battlefield in the manner of Virginia. No great armies marched across it in blue and gray lines, no Gettysburgs, Antietam's, or long fields of corpses laid out for photographers to document. Instead, an older, more intimate, and far more terrible conflict prevailed. A war of neighbors against neighbors, of the boy who had kissed your daughter last spring, now riding up your lane with a pistol and a grudge, of the man who helped raise your barn in '59, now informing on your husband to the Home Guard. The state had officially declared for the Union. Yet, in the western counties, where the Missouri River bent south and the land reached toward Kansas, loyalties were divided straight down the middle of every family and congregation. Brothers rode for opposing sides, fathers disowned sons, wives denounced husbands from the pulpit, and old men who had voted Whig, Democrat, and nothing in their long lives now voted with their rifles, not always for the side their neighbors expected. Into that fractured country came the bushwhackers. They called themselves partisan rangers, guerrillas, or simply boys, while the Union labeled them murderers. They rode in small bands of 10 or 20, armed with revolvers and shotguns, moving through timber and river bottoms like ghosts, burning out Union sympathizers, ambushing federal patrols, and living off civilian farms, demanding meals, fodder, and horses, with woe to any family that refused. On the other side, the Home Guard and enrolled Missouri militia, often staffed by men with private scores to settle, rode up the same lanes in blue coats, performing much the same work, only with state authority behind them. A farmer in Blackwater County during the summer of '63 might be robbed at breakfast by one armed band and at supper by another, with neither feeling obligated to leave him alive afterward. Because in a war, where everyone is guilty of something, eliminating a witness becomes a minor matter of housekeeping. The most famous bushwhacker, a lean-faced schoolteacher named William Clark Quantrill, had ridden into the Kansas town of Lawrence on the morning of August 21, 1863, with 450 men at his back. By sunset that same day, 150 unarmed civilians lay dead in the streets, and the entire town center was burning. Every household in Blackwater County knew the story of Lawrence by the first week of September, and every household understood its implications. The rules, whatever rules had existed, were finished. If a man with 400 horsemen could ride into a town of 2,000 and kill men and boys in their nightshirts while their wives watched, then nothing was safe anywhere, no door was thick enough, and no neighbor could be relied upon. The federal response to Lawrence came 4 days later, on August 25th, in the form of a single sheet of paper signed by Brigadier General Thomas Ewing, Jr., commanding the District of the Border, known as General Order No. 11. It instructed every person residing in the 4 western Missouri counties of Jackson, Cass, Bates, and the northern half of Verne, except for a narrow strip along military roads, to abandon their homes within 15 days, taking only what they could carry. Everything else, the order declared, would be seized or burned. The purpose, Ewing wrote, was to deny the bushwhackers their civilian support base by emptying the country of civilians altogether. Families who had lived in those counties for 40 years were given 2 weeks to become refugees. 20,000 people were turned out onto the roads before the first frost, and the country they left behind became known for a generation as the Burnt District. What Ewing did not put in writing, but what every officer under his command understood, was that the 4 named counties were not the only ones where the order would be enforced. In practice, any county within a day's ride of the Kansas line, or any county where guerrilla activity was reported, could be treated similarly at local commanders' discretion. Blackwater County was not on the official list, but by mid-September 1863, it hosted a small federal garrison at the county seat commanded by a captain from Illinois named Josiah Pickering, who had been granted considerable discretion indeed. This is the setting, and the moment in which 9 families disappeared. The first to go were the Hollisters. Ephraim Hollister, 51 years old, was a widower with 4 grown children still at home and 2 grandchildren in a back bedroom. His wife Martha had died of milk sickness in 1858, and he had raised the youngest children alone with help from his oldest daughter, Rebecca, 23 that summer, who already had 2 little ones of her own after her husband was killed at Wilson's Creek in 61. Ephraim owned 160 acres on the eastern branch of the Blackwater River, featuring a sound cabin with a stone chimney, spring house, smokehouse, tobacco barn, and a team of Belgian draft horses purchased at a Boonville sale the previous spring. He was known in the county as a quiet man, a fair dealer, a strict Baptist who did not drink spirits or curse, and a reliable neighbor who had never turned anyone away from his door. On the morning of September 14, 1863, a man named Asa Crenshaw rode over to the Hollister place to borrow a whetstone for his scythe. Crenshaw, 63 years old, was a Methodist lay preacher with a bad limp from a horse accident in his youth, living about 1.25 miles away across the timber. He had known Ephraim Hollister for 22 years. They had helped each other at every harvest since before the war, buried each other's wives, and shared the last good jug of peach brandy in the county on the 4th of July in 62, sitting on the Hollister porch with their feet up, arguing about the war until the moon sank behind the trees. When Asa Crenshaw rode into the Hollister yard that morning, the dogs were gone. That was the first thing he noticed. The Hollisters kept 3 hounds and a yellow mongrel that slept on the porch, and none appeared. The second thing Crenshaw noticed was that the chickens remained in the yard, scratching at the packed earth, with no corn thrown for them. Ephraim Hollister threw corn to the chickens every morning before breakfast, something you could set a watch by. The third thing he noticed, as he rode closer, was that the front door of the cabin stood half open, with a gingham apron caught on the latch, flapping gently in the morning breeze. Crenshaw called out from the yard and, receiving no answer, tied his mule to the hitching post and walked onto the porch. He stood there for a moment with his hand on the door frame, listening, because the silence emanating from the cabin was the wrong kind of silence, the kind with a shape to it, the kind a man who has lived his whole life in the country recognizes, as he would recognize an approaching storm. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The table was set for breakfast for 7 people. Cornbread sat in the skillet on the hearth, now cold, with a knife beside it. A pitcher of buttermilk on the table had curdled and separated in the warm morning air, a fly walking on its rim. 7 plates, 7 tin cups, 7 places laid with knives and spoons, none touched. A half peeled apple lay on a cutting board at the table's end, the peel still attached in one long spiral, as if the hand holding the knife had simply set it down and walked away. The back bedroom where Ephraim's daughter Rebecca slept with her 2 children was empty, the bed unmade, the quilt pulled back as if she had risen to answer a call, a child's rag doll on the floor, with one button eye missing. The loft where the 3 sons slept was empty, a clean shirt folded on the bed as though someone had been about to put it on. Outside, the draft horses remained in the barn, the wagon under the lean-to. Nothing had been taken, nothing broken, no blood, no sign of struggle, no tracks of wagon wheels leading away beyond those already there for weeks. The only thing out of place, Crenshaw would later recall, was that the Hollister family Bible, always kept on a small shelf above the hearth, had been taken down and laid open on the table, face up next to the cornbread skillet, open to the 37th Psalms. Fret not thyself because of evildoers, for they shall soon be cut down like the grass and wither as the green herb. Asa Crenshaw rode to the county seat that same afternoon and reported the Hollisters missing to the sheriff. Sheriff Reuben Vaughn, a tired man trying to hold the county together with his bare hands since the war started, rode out to the Hollister farm the next morning with 2 deputies, finding exactly what Crenshaw had described. He wrote a brief report, filed it with the county clerk, looked at the open Bible on the table for a long time, then closed it gently, returned it to its shelf, and walked out of the cabin. Standing on the porch in the cool September air, he felt for the first time in his 11 years as sheriff a fear that had nothing to do with bullets or blades. A fear of the absence of sound, of 7 place settings untouched. And then, because a war was on, and because men and women disappeared in Missouri every week in 1863 for 100 different reasons, he did what any sheriff would have done. He put the Hollister case at the back of a drawer and waited to see if anyone returned. No one did. 6 days later, on September 20th, the Tillman family vanished. 8 people this time, including a grandmother of 74 who had been bedridden for 3 years with crippling arthritis that made her cry out whenever she was moved. The Tillman cabin was found in the same condition as the Hollister cabins, a meal laid out. This time a supper of beans, ham, and cornbread gone cold in the pot, beds unmade, clothes in the press, livestock in the yard, hungry but alive, no blood, no tracks, no sign. The old grandmother, Eliza Tillman, who had not walked under her own power since the winter of '60, was gone from her bed, covers turned back, her wooden cane still leaning against the wall. Whoever had taken her had carried her out, gently enough that her little glass of laudanum on the bedside table had not even been spilled. 4 days after that, on September 24th, the Latham family vanished. 9 people this time. The Latham girl, Sarah, had been engaged to marry a boy from the next county over, and her wedding dress was found laid out on her bed, finished, pinned, ready for the final fitting, with a small bouquet of pressed flowers tied with a blue ribbon sitting on the pillow beside it. The boy she was to marry, a young farmer named Caleb Renfro from across the river, rode over when he heard the news and sat on the edge of her bed for 2 hours without moving. When he finally rode home, he would not speak for 3 days, and when he did, he said that Sarah would not have left that dress behind. Not for the devil himself, not for anything on earth. She had worked on it for 7 months. If she had walked out of that cabin and left that dress folded on the bed, then she had not walked out. Someone had walked her out. And that, Caleb Renfro said, was what he could not live with. 3 weeks later, Caleb Renfro was found hanged in his father's barn. The coroner ruled it suicide, though his father, who had taken the body down at dawn, never fully agreed. By October 1st, Sheriff Vaughn had 3 empty houses on his desk and a growing certainty that whatever was happening was not the work of ordinary bushwhackers. Bushwhackers took horses, food, and revenge, but not entire families while leaving horses behind. They did not take grandmothers who could not walk, and certainly not so quietly that no one within 3 miles heard a single gunshot or scream. The Latham farm lay within 800 yards of Crenshaw's place, and Asa Crenshaw had been awake that entire night with a sick calf in the barn, hearing nothing but, once around 200 a.m., the faint squeak of a wagon axle passing along the river road, which he had taken for a neighbor driving home late from town. On October 3rd, Vaughan rode to the federal garrison at the county seat and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. Pickering, a thin man of 34 with sharp features, a close, cropped beard, an Illinois accent, and a habit of cleaning his fingernails with a penknife while others spoke, listened to Vaughan's account of the 3 missing families with an expression of professional concern. He asked a few quiet questions about the farm's locations, whether any of the missing families had harbored guerrilla sympathies, and, when Vaughan said they had not, nodded thoughtfully and wrote something in a small leather notebook. He then told the sheriff that the disappearances were almost certainly the work of guerrillas crossing down from the Lay mine bottoms, and that the federal garrison had neither the men nor the orders to investigate civilian disappearances in an active war zone. Vaughan should go home and tend to the living. Reuben Vaughn left Pickering's office that afternoon with a cold feeling he could not articulate. 20 years later, on his deathbed outside St. Louis, he would try to explain that feeling to his grandson and fail. The grandson wrote it down as best he could remember. It was the feeling of speaking to a man who already knew the answer to every question you were asking him, and who was waiting politely for you to stop asking them. And that was the feeling of being measured like a pig at the market by eyes that had already decided what price you were worth. In the weeks that followed, as the Missouri sky shifted from hot September, blue to the flat pewter of October, and the first hard frosts descended from the north, 6 more families vanished from Blackwater County, the Corbins. 5 people on October 11th from a cabin near Sugar Creek, the Osgoods. 7 people on October 17th from a fine 2-story clapboard house with a library of 40 books and a rosewood piano Mrs. Osgood had played every evening. The McCaskills, a family of 11 including 2 hired hands, on October 24th from a large working farm with a dairy herd still lowing in the barn the next morning. A family named Risley, 4 people. On November 1st, a family named Wagoner, 6 people. On November 8th, and finally, on the night of November 15th, 1863, a family named Beaumont, 10 people, the largest household in the county, from a cabin less than 2 miles from the federal garrison itself. 9 households, 67 people. Not one body, not one witness, not one shot fired. The community's response to this progression was not what later historians might expect. Not outrage or panic, but something colder, more recognizable to anyone who has lived through a long, relentless wartime, the slow shrinkage of the human animal into itself. The pulling back of curtains, the locking of shutters, the quiet agreement among neighbors not to ride out after dark and not to ask too many questions in daylight. By the first week of November, people had stopped visiting each other for supper. By the second week, they had stopped waving from their wagons. When passing on the road, the churches emptied out. The general store in New Salisbury reported that women were sending their husbands to buy weekly flour because they no longer wanted to leave the farms, even for an hour, even on a Saturday morning. On the farms themselves, families slept in shifts, one man or boy awake at all times with a loaded shotgun across his knees, watching the road and tree line by the light of a single candle that burned low and slow through the long October nights. But the thing the families could not protect themselves against, it would turn out, was not what they were watching for. They were watching for bushwhackers, for strangers, for the galloping hoofbeats of Quantrill's men. Every Missouri farmer had seen Quantrill in his dreams at least once. What they were not watching for was a polite knock at the door around 10:00 at night and a familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, a quiet voice speaking words that could almost be mistaken for kindness. Decades later, long after the war had ended and the country had moved on to other nightmares, the empty farms of Blackwater County passed into regional folklore. Travelers in the 1870s and 80s reported seeing lamps lit in windows of houses abandoned for 20 years. A journalist from the Kansas City Star writing through in 1891 wrote a short piece for the Sunday edition, calling the region the County of Empty Tables, because every old homestead contained an empty table set for a meal nobody had lived to eat. School children growing up in New Salisbury in the early 20th century told stories about the Hollister cabin, still standing in a cornfield, about the ghost of the little girl who had left her rag doll on the floor, and about the sound of a spiral of apple peel unrolling in an empty room. But the folklore was wrong in one important respect. The tables had not been empty when the families left. They had been full. And whoever, or whatever, had taken those families had done so not in haste or fear, but with a patience and completeness suggesting something far worse than a bushwhacker raid. Someone had come to those cabins, led those families out into the night one by one over 2 months, and ensured no trace of the going was left behind. If you are finding this story as unsettling as I am, take a moment to hit the like button and leave a comment with your theory about what happened in Blackwater County. I read every comment, and your ideas shape the stories I tell next. Now, let us return to the beginning and examine what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn began to discover when he finally stopped trusting the federal garrison and started investigating on his own. The first thing Vaughn noticed, once he laid the deeds of the 9 missing families out on the table in his small office, was that the farms were not random. He had initially assumed the bushwhackers, or whoever was responsible, had taken whichever families were easiest to reach. But when he plotted the 9 farms on a county map, using little black pins from the tailor shop next door, the pattern was not random at all. The 9 farms formed a rough arc along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, stretching some 11 miles from the northern county line down to the river landing in the south. They were among the best watered, best timbered, most productive parcels in the county, sitting astride the only natural corridor for any future railroad line from Boonville south toward the Ozarks. A corridor surveyed in 1859 by Pacific Railroad engineers and discussed in newspapers is a near certainty once the war ended and the economy recovered, and they were all, without exception, adjacent to land acquired within the last 18 months by a single purchaser, a SAIT, Lewis Land Company called Pickering and Latham Associates. Vaughan stared at that name for a long time. Pickering, the same surname as the federal captain at the garrison, and Latham, the same surname as the second missing family, whose patriarch, old Calvin Latham, had been one of the most vocal opponents of wartime land speculation in the county, warning his neighbors in the summer of 1863 not to sell their deeds to any agent of any St. Louis company under any circumstances. Old Calvin, a fierce veteran of the Black Hawk War, who carried his grievances in a small notebook in his breast pocket, had given speeches on the courthouse steps in June and July about how the war was being used by men in St. Louis, Chicago, and Philadelphia to strip Western farmers of everything they had built. He had named names, pounded his fist on the courthouse porch rail until it shook. Calvin Latham had disappeared with his entire family on September 24th. Vaughan rode to the county recorder's office the next morning and spent 6 hours working through the deed books. He found that Pickering and Latham Associates had, between the spring of 1862 and the autumn of 1863, purchased 41 parcels of land in Blackwater County, all along the eastern bank of the Blackwater River, all within a mile of the 9 farms that had recently gone empty. The purchases had been made at remarkably low prices. In several cases, deeds were signed over by widows whose husbands had been killed by guerrillas earlier that year, who needed cash quickly to feed their children through the winter. In other cases, sellers were listed as relocated to Illinois or Iowa, though no forwarding addresses were recorded and no one in the county seemed to know where they had gone. In a few cases, most troublingly, the signatures on the deeds appeared, to Vaughan's careful eye, to have been written in a hand very different from that on other county records bearing the same name. Vaughan began very cautiously to ask questions. He rode out to the Wagoner place, one of the missing farms, and searched the abandoned cabin with a care he had not used on his first visit. He looked behind cupboards, lifted trunk lids, went up into the loft, and pulled back mattress ticking on each bed. In a hollow beneath a loose floorboard under the bed in the main room, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cotton, he found a small packet of letters addressed to Samuel Wagoner, written over 4 months between June and October of 1863, signed by an agent of Pickering and Latham Associates named Horace Osgood, the same surname as another missing family. Vaughan sat down on the edge of the Wagoner's bed and read the letters in order by the slanted afternoon light through the cabin's single window. On their surface, the letters were polite business correspondence. The first, dated June 8th, introduced Horace Osgood as a representative of a St. Louis firm interested in acquiring agricultural land in Blackwater County for post-war development, offering Samuel Wagoner a fair market price for his 120 acres. The second, dated July 3rd, expressed polite disappointment at Mr. Wagoner's refusal and raised the offer by 15%. The third, dated July 29th, raised it again and mentioned, casually, that several neighbors had recently accepted similar offers and relocated with their families to new lands in central Iowa the company had arranged. The fourth, dated August 20th, was different in tone, mentioning by name the wife and children of Samuel Wagoner, asking sympathetically about young Elias Wagoner's health, and observing that the countryside had become very dangerous for young families, with a man bearing responsibilities a childless man could not fully understand. The fifth, dated September 10th, 6 days before the Hollister family vanished, spoke at length about the difficulty of protecting a rural family from bushwhackers and home guard alike, expressing the writer's genuine hope Mr. Wagoner would reconsider before events overtook the matter. The sixth, dated October 4th, contained a single sentence that made Reuben Vaughn sit down on the Wagoner's dusty floor and put his face in his hands. "We have arrangements, Mr. Wagoner, that can provide for the safety of your family in exchange for your cooperation, and we would be grieved to see you refuse a kindness that others in your position have been grateful to accept." Others in your position. Vaughan rode back to town with the letters in his saddlebag. That night, in the small room he rented above the dry goods store, he began to understand what had happened, or a version of it, which turned out not to be the whole, though enough to get him killed. Some of the missing families, he reasoned, had been coerced, told that bushwhackers or federal troops were coming for them, offered safe passage out of the county in exchange for signing their deeds over to Pickering and Latham Associates. They had left in the night, walking or riding with an escort, promised new land in Illinois or Iowa. Whether any had actually made it was another question entirely. But at least some, he believed, had walked out of their cabins willingly, believing they were being saved. Perhaps the first 2 or 3 families had actually boarded a wagon, ridden to a distant depot, reached Iowa, and been given new land. Because that was how a scheme of this kind would have to begin, sending the first few families through the machine honestly, so their letters back to the county would confirm the story. But somewhere along the way, the scheme changed. Somewhere along the way, the men running it realized they did not need to pay for new land in Iowa if they could simply make families disappear and forge the deeds. The cost of moving 67 people to another state had exceeded the profit the land company was willing to accept, and the mathematics of the enterprise had been adjusted. That was the meaning of the 4 words Vaughan would pin a month later to the inside of his ledger. They took them willing. The families had gone willingly, led out by people they trusted or had reason to fear, believing at least in that first hour they were being rescued from something worse. And the worst part was that the people who led them out had known from the beginning where the road actually ended. But Vaughan did not yet know what had happened to them after they left their cabins. Whether they had been put on a train at some distant depot and sent to Iowa as promised, or led to a quieter fate in the timber south of the river. He did not know which of his neighbors were part of the scheme and which were merely its victims, who in the Pickering family was the mastermind and who the errand boy. He did not know any of these things yet, and he was about to make the mistake of trying to find out. On the morning of November 22nd, 1863, 1 week after the disappearance of the Beaumont family, Sheriff Reuben Vaughn rode to the federal garrison and requested a formal meeting with Captain Josiah Pickering. He brought with him a canvas satchel containing the Wagoner letters, a copy of the deed records from the county recorder, and a list of 41 parcels he believed had been acquired by fraud, coercion, or worse. He intended to confront Pickering directly with the evidence and give him one chance, as a Union officer, to explain himself before Vaughan sent a copy to the provost marshal in Jefferson City. Pickering received him cordially, offered coffee, listened without interrupting for 45 minutes as Vaughan laid out the evidence with the steady, methodical voice a lawman uses when building his case in public, examined the deed records, and read the Wagoner letters slowly one by one. When he finished, he set the last letter down, looked up at Vaughan with a small, thoughtful expression on his thin face, and said, "Sheriff, I believe you have done a remarkable piece of work here, and I'm going to ask you to do one more thing before we proceed. I'm going to ask you to wait here in this office for 1 hour while I send for a colleague of mine from the provost's office in Sedalia. He needs to hear this from you directly. Will you wait?" Reuben Vaughn, who had been a sheriff in Missouri for 11 years and had seen men lie to him in 100 different ways, looked at Captain Josiah Pickering across the desk and did not see a single sign of deceit. No sign of anything at all. Pickering's face was as smooth and empty as a plate. Vaughan said he would wait. Pickering rose, put on his coat, and walked out. What happened in the next 40 minutes is known only from a letter Vaughan wrote that same afternoon to his sister in St. Louis, mailed from a farmhouse 5 miles west of town, after riding out of the garrison through a side gate at a flat gallop, with a federal bullet through the crown of his hat. In the letter, Vaughan described hearing through the closed door of Pickering's office. The captain's voice speaking quietly to a sergeant in the outer room, giving instructions that included the words, "No trial, forever," and "tonight." He described understanding in a single cold moment. What those 3 words meant when put together, and what they had meant on 9 previous occasions over the preceding 2 months. He described climbing out of the office window, dropping into a narrow alley between garrison buildings, working his way through the stable yard, crouched behind a water trough, while a stable hand whistled 2 feet away, and did not see him, stealing a cavalry horse whose reins he cut with his pocket knife because he had no time to untee them, and riding south through the timber with 2 troopers in pursuit firing revolvers at his back. He described, at the letter's end, his conviction he would not live very long. He asked his sister to keep the letter, and if anything happened to him, to take it to a particular lawyer in St. Louis whose name he wrote in the margin. He closed with a single sentence she would repeat in later years to anyone who asked about her brother's death. "I have seen a face that belongs to the worst man I have ever met. And the worst thing about it is that it is the face of a man who believes himself to be an officer and a gentleman, and who has never for one moment doubted that he is." Just when you think the story could not possibly get darker, the horror in Blackwater County intensifies. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark American mysteries. Hit the like button to support the channel, and subscribe so you never miss another one of these forgotten histories. Now let us find out what Sheriff Reuben Vaughn discovered in the last month of his life, and what he hid, and where he hid it, so that someone eventually might find it. Vaughan did not ride to Jefferson City. He understood, by the time he crossed the Lamine River the next morning, that if the conspiracy reached as high as a federal captain, it probably reached higher, and that the provost marshal's office was as likely to hang him as to hear him. Instead, he rode north into the timber country along the Missouri River, disappearing into a network of old friends, fellow Masons, and distant cousins stretching from Boonville to Glasgow. He spent the next 3 weeks living in barns and root cellars, moving every second night, never sleeping in the same place twice. He wrote in a small leather-bound notebook kept inside his shirt every scrap of information he could remember, and every piece of evidence he had gathered, the names of the 41 parcels and dates of each transaction, the text of the Wagoner letters reconstructed from memory, the words he had heard through Pickering's door. Then, in the first week of December, he did something nobody has ever fully understood. He rode back to Blackwater County. He did not go to the county seat, nor home, nor stop at his own house where his wife still waited, not knowing whether he was alive or dead, whether to wear mourning or keep his supper warm. He rode instead, in the middle of the night, to the farm of Asa Crenshaw, the old Methodist lay preacher who had first discovered the empty Hollister cabin. Crenshaw took him in, fed him, and listened to his story for 4 hours by the light of a single tallow candle. When Vaughan had finished, Crenshaw sat in silence for a long time with his hands folded on the table and his eyes fixed on the candle flame. Then said something Vaughan wrote down in his notebook that same night. "I think I know where they are, Sheriff. I think I have known for some time, and I think that when I show you, you will understand why I have not spoken of it sooner. And you will not, I think, find it in yourself to judge me too harshly. Because I am an old man with a wife who cannot feed herself and 2 grandchildren in the back room. And the knowledge of what I am about to show you is the kind of knowledge that a man in this country, in this year of our Lord, cannot carry alone and live the next morning before dawn. The two men rowed south along the Blackwater River to a place the old French voyagers called the Bend, where the river made a sharp hook around a high limestone bluff, and the current cut a deep pool beneath the rock face. The pool was some 40 feet across and of uncertain depth. Local children had been warned away for as long as anyone could remember, because the current at the bluff's base was treacherous. The limestone above had a way of shedding slabs without warning, and the older people said the pool did not give back what it took. 2 boys had drowned there in the 1840s and one in the 1850s. None of their bodies ever recovered. The river carried what it took, the saying went, all the way down to the Gulf. Crenshaw dismounted at the edge of the bluff and led Vaughan down a narrow game trail, barely wide enough for a single horse, winding through scrub cedar and limestone to emerge, after perhaps 4 minutes, on a broad natural platform of pale rock some 12 feet above the pool. Halfway down, the trail passed a shelf where the limestone had been recently disturbed. Fresh scratches showed where heavy stones had been rolled, and the earth beneath was softer than the surrounding ground, as if dug and refilled many times. Along the platform's edge, where a person standing at the water's edge might pause before whatever came next, the rock face had been scored in a dozen places by what looked like boot nails and the drag of heavy heels. Crenshaw pointed to the shelf and said, "See it there? I came down here in late September, Sheriff, because I was looking for a lost calf, and I saw 2 men standing where we are standing now, rolling a stone into the pool. I hid in the brush where that cedar leans over the trail and watched them. They were strong men, working in their shirt sleeves, and the stone they rolled was the size of a whiskey barrel. It went into the water with a sound I have not been able to get out of my dreams since. When they finished and left, I came down and looked at what was left on the ground. What was left was a child's shoe. A girl's shoe, brown leather with a small brass buckle. It was the shoe of Ephraim Hollister's granddaughter. I had seen her wear it at the camp meeting in August. I picked it up, took it home. Still hidden behind a loose board in my spring house, where my wife will not find it. And I have not spoken of it in 3 months, because I have a wife and 2 grandchildren of my own, and a good Methodist knowledge of what this country has become. And I was afraid. God forgive me, Sheriff. I was afraid." Vaughan stood on the shelf and looked down at the dark water, not speaking for a long time. The morning mist lay on the pool's surface in thin gray ribbons. A single crow called from the bluff above, and the water was so still he could see his own face in it, looking back from a great depth. Then he asked Crenshaw how many times he thought the stones had been rolled. Crenshaw could not be sure, but the earth disturbance suggested many separate occasions, spread over the weeks when the families disappeared. Perhaps 1 visit per family, perhaps 2 for the larger ones. Vaughan asked if Crenshaw had recognized the 2 men. Crenshaw said he had, and that this was the hardest part. One was Horace Osgood, the land agent who had written to Samuel Waggoner. The other was a sergeant from the federal garrison at the county seat, a man named Luther Pickering, the captain's cousin. Vaughan took out his notebook, wrote the 2 names down, and rode back to Crenshaw's farm in silence. That night, in the preacher's barn, Vaughan copied every page of his notebook into a second ledger. A larger one Crenshaw had kept for farm accounts, and never filled more than halfway. He worked by the light of a single lantern hung from a nail in a beam, writing for 6 hours. When he finished, he pinned to the inside of the cover a single sheet of paper on which he wrote, in a hand already beginning to shake from what he knew. 4 words. They took them willing. He did not mean by those words that the families had gone willing to their deaths. He meant they had gone willing out of their cabins, believing they were being saved. And this was the worst part of the whole matter, because it meant they had trusted the men who killed them, and those men had used that trust as the instrument of the killing. He meant that a betrayal of that depth was something for which American law, as he had practiced it for 11 years, had no adequate name. He gave the ledger to Asa Crenshaw, asking him to hide it somewhere no one would find until the war was over and the country came to its senses. Crenshaw wrapped the ledger in double oilcloth, tied it with hemp cord, and buried it beneath the packed earth floor of his root cellar in a corner behind barrels of smoked pork, under a stone marked on its underside with a small cross-in-candle suit. In the morning, Reuben Vaughn rode east toward Jefferson City for the second time, intending now to reach the State House in person and place the original notebook and his sworn testimony into the governor's hands. He never arrived. On December 19, 1863, his body was found in a creek bed some 40 miles east of Blackwater County with 2 pistol balls in the back of his head. The official report listed the cause as murder by persons unknown, probably bushwhackers. His horse was never recovered, his saddlebags empty. The notebook gone. His widow received a brief letter of condolence from the provost marshal's office along with his watch, found in his vest pocket, and his wedding ring cut from his finger and returned in a paper envelope without explanation. The county clerk, a man named Elijah Redfern, who had helped Vaughan compile the original ledger of missing families in October, heard of the sheriff's death on the morning of December 22nd. He spent that afternoon in his office at the courthouse going through the papers. Vaughan had left in his desk drawer, finding enough to understand, in outline, what his friend the sheriff had uncovered and what it had cost him. 2 days later, on Christmas Eve, Elijah Redfern took the coach to Sedalia, rented a room at a boarding house on Ohio Avenue, wrote a summary of everything he knew in the margins of his personal copy of the county's missing persons register, pinned a single sheet to the inside cover copying the same 4 words Vaughan had given him. They took them willing, then walked to the apothecary on Main Street, purchased a bottle of laudanum, returned to his room, and drank the entire bottle before lying down on the bed with his hands folded over his chest. He was found by the boarding housekeeper the next morning, Christmas Day, 1863. The coroner ruled the death an accidental overdose from medicine taken for nervous complaints, and the ledger in his valise was returned unexamined to the clerk's office in New Salisbury, placed in a locked cabinet by the acting clerk and forgotten. The ledger, buried beneath Asa Crenshaw's root cellar, remained where he had put it. Crenshaw himself died of pneumonia in the winter of 1867, without telling anyone in his family what lay beneath the cellar floor. He had intended several times to tell his son, tried once on a Sunday afternoon in the spring of '66, and lost his nerve halfway through a sentence, turning the conversation to planting corn. The farm was sold out of the family in 1872, after his son moved west to Kansas, and the new owners tore down the old cabin, built a new one on a different part of the property, and the abandoned root cellar slowly filled with dirt and rubble and was forgotten. In the spring of 1923, a young historian from the University of Missouri, named Ellsworth Hadley, working on a doctoral dissertation about the civilian cost of the Missouri guerrilla war, came to Blackwater County looking for primary sources. He spent 3 weeks interviewing elderly residents in their parlors and on their porches, patiently drawing out stories their parents and grandparents had told them, and they had never thought to write down. In the course of those interviews, he heard from the granddaughter of Asa Crenshaw a story Her grandmother had whispered on her deathbed about a sheriff who had come to the farm one night in the winter of '63 and left something important buried in the old root cellar before he rode east to die. The granddaughter had not known whether to believe it. Her grandmother had been 91 and in and out of her senses in her final week. But she repeated it to the young historian because he seemed genuinely interested. A polite young man with a notebook and good manners, and she had nobody else to tell. Hadley got permission from the current owner to dig. On the afternoon of April 11th, 1923, in a drizzling spring rain that turned the earth to cold clay under his hands, he unearthed a rotted oilcloth packet, and inside, remarkably preserved, was Reuben Vaughan's second ledger. Hadley spent 6 months transcribing and verifying its contents. He rode out to the bend where the river, still hooked around the limestone bluff, stood on the platform above the pool and looked down into the dark water. He cross-referenced the deed records, tracked down what had become of Pickering and Lotham Associates, and found in the St. Louis Probate Court archives the will of Horace Osgood, who had died a wealthy man in 1891, his estate at death including controlling interests in 4 Missouri banks, a St. Louis hotel, and some 13,000 acres along the Blackwater and Lamine rivers, including every one of the 41 parcels acquired by the old land company during the war. He found that Captain Josiah Pickering, not at the end of the war, had been promoted to major, resigned his commission honorably in 1866, returned to Illinois, become a state senator, and died in his bed in 1904, widely mourned by his constituents. He found that Luther Pickering, the sergeant, had been killed in a saloon brawl in Kansas City in 1871, and at the time of his death was carrying a silver pocket watch engraved with the initials E.H., which Hadley believed, though he could not prove, had belonged to Ephraim Hollister. Most painfully, he found that the railroad line surveyed in 1859 had indeed been built in the 1880s, running directly along the corridor defined by the 41 parcels, and that the sale of those parcels to the railroad company in 1883 had made the heirs of Horace Osgood and Josiah Pickering richer in a single transaction than any of the 9 families killed for them could have imagined becoming in 20 lifetimes of honest work. Hadley submitted his findings, along with the ledger itself, to the Missouri Historical Society in the autumn of 1923. The Society's board of directors reviewed the material and, on a vote of 5-2, declined to publish. The minutes of that meeting, eventually declassified in the 1960s, indicate that the majority believed the evidence was strong, but that the descendants of several families named in the ledger were prominent citizens of St. Louis and Chicago, and publication would cause a degree of distress disproportionate to the public interest at this remove of time. The ledger was placed in the Society's closed archives. Hadley's dissertation, under pressure from his department chair, was rewritten to focus on other, less controversial aspects of the Missouri War. Hadley himself, a deeply disappointed man who had spent his own money pursuing the investigation, took a teaching position at a small college in Indiana and never published on the subject again. He died in 1941, leaving behind a box of private papers his wife donated to his alma mater, where they sat unread in a basement storage room for another 40 years. The ledger was finally read by outside researchers in 1967, when the Missouri Historical Society opened its closed archives for the state's centennial of the Civil War. 2 articles were written, one in a regional historical journal with a readership of perhaps 400 specialists, the other in the Sunday supplement of a Kansas City newspaper, read by a few thousand people for a few days and then forgotten. The descendants of the Pickering and Osgood families, by then scattered across 4 states and several generations, were never publicly named. and no criminal investigation was ever opened because the statute of limitations on murder in Missouri, though technically unlimited, is functionally meaningless when every person involved has been dead for half a century and every piece of physical evidence lies under 40 feet of river water. This mystery shows us something American history has always been uncomfortable saying out loud, that in the chaos of a great war, some people do not become heroes, some do not become villains, but some, quietly, in the shadow of real violence, use the cover of that violence to do small and terrible things for money. Those small and terrible things can remain hidden for 100 years because everyone involved has a reason to look the other way. The families of Blackwater County did not vanish. They were taken one by men they knew who told them lies they wanted to believe. Walked down a narrow trail to a pool beneath a limestone bluff, and the river carried the evidence away. Their land was bought for pennies on the dollar. Their descendants, the ones sent away as small children in the first months before the killings began, grew up elsewhere under new names and never knew. Their houses stood empty until the plows finally broke them down and the fields grew over. The railroad came, the stations were built, the towns along the line prospered, and the children of the men who had done the killing went to good schools, served in legislatures, and were buried under marble monuments far from the pool, beneath the bluff. The 4 words Sheriff Reuben Vaughn pinned to the inside of his ledger in the last week of his life remain, perhaps, the truest 4 words anyone has ever written about that season in that county. They took them willing, because the deepest horror of Blackwater County was not the killing. The deepest horror was the trust that made the killing possible. It was the polite knock at the door after dark, the familiar face on the porch holding a lantern, the quiet voice saying, "Get the children dressed. It is not safe here anymore. Come with me, and I will take you somewhere you will be safe." It was the willingness of the human heart to believe the worst thing cannot happen to it, because the person telling the lie is somebody it has known all its life, and it is the knowledge carried home by every one of those 67 people in the last 10 minutes of their lives. As the trail narrowed and the limestone platform came into view, and the men in the shadows stepped forward, with the stones already prepared, that they had been wrong. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything has been revealed? Or do you think there are still families out there, descended from the survivors, who carry fragments of the truth without knowing what they mean? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more forgotten American histories like this one, subscribe to the channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload, and share this video with someone who believes, as I do, that the past is never really past, and that the things we bury always eventually come back up. I will see you in the next video.